The reason why we're here, and we asked the question, what's so important about Cape Race? And it has to go back to the days of the sailing ships when if you just took off out from New York or out from the you come out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you would want to come around using waypoints and landmarks around the southern coast of Newfoundland. If you went right out into the Atlantic Ocean, you'd soon be set by fog and lose your way pretty rapidly with the currents and all that. You wouldn't know where you were within a few days. Right. But you'd be, picking out your waypoints and your landmarks. But when you came to Cape Race, you could see that there's really nothing east of that, and you would make your turn north and east, going up to England or into Northern Europe. Okay. And really you only have Greenland and Iceland to worry about. Right. If you went straight east, you'd end up in Portugal, so you would come out to Cape Race and make your turn. So it was very important to know where Cape Race was. Right. Especially with if you come over to this map, you would see Mistaken Point here and Cape Race here. But if you would obscure Cape Race by fog, Mistaken Point would look like the end of the peninsula. Right. And you would make your turn far too soon. So that would be kind of a disaster for you. Okay.
So now, sorry to interrupt, people say that there's some story about how the name Mistaken Point came about. Is there a story to that as well?
Well, it came about because it was a mistaken point. If you made your turn too soon, it was a disastrous mistake. Right. If you were in a sailing ship and you made that turn, you wouldn't have the ability to come completely about. And come back out of it. So you would end up in Long Beach, and that's the reason why this area is particularly dangerous for sailing vessels.
Right. Okay.
From right in here, around St. Vincent's to around to Witless Bay, there are over 400 known shipwrecks alone here.
400?
400.
Wow.
So this area right in here is called the graveyard of the Atlantic. Okay. So very early on, the British Admiralty realized that Cape Race was an important landmark. Okay. And their first efforts to denote this important feature was to actually set up a pile of logs and light it on fire out at the end of the Cape. Okay. As you can tell, there aren't a whole lot of trees, so it's not a very efficient way to go about marking the landmark unless you were bringing in very large quantities of logs. Right. In the early 1850s, I could say about 1858, so mid-1850s, they built a lighthouse here at Cape Race, and there's a model of it right here. That lighthouse stood until 1907. It was removed from here and moved into Nova Scotia. Okay. After the Canadian government took over Cape Race, they took it over in the 1880s, I believe, late 1880s. Okay. And that's kind of unique in itself because Newfoundland was its own country. Right. But it was important enough to Canadian shipping that the Canadian government actually took it over. Right. This, again, was moved to Nova Scotia, and in I believe it was the 1980s, it was moved again to Ottawa, to the Museum of Science and Technology. That lighthouse stands there today. Okay.
Like the original lighthouse? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
It was made out of iron and wood covering, so it was able to be disassembled. Okay. Now that light, it was a fixed light, so it had no period. Okay. It had no flash to it. Right. And it's important for waypoint type lighthouses to have a flash, so they, and that period, in other words, how long it takes between flashes is important to designate what lighthouse you're actually looking at. Right. So Cape Race's current lighthouse has a what they call a hyper-radium Fresnel lens in it. It weighs 20,000 pounds, made out of crystal glass, hand-grown, and within a brass frame. It sits in a bath of mercury.
Okay.
About 4 liters of mercury is enough to float that.
Okay.
And that basically provides this friction-free, corrosion-proof bearing.
Okay.
It has been there since 1907, but the thing about those hyper radials,
Uh-huh.
there are the largest class of Fresnel lenses that were ever made.
Right.
They made between 37 and 40 of them right around the turn of about 1900. So
Okay.
you're talking a few years before, and by 1910 they were using other technologies, much like you would see like a searchlight, so you'd have rotating electric lights.
Right. Right.
This originally had a oil lantern, or a pressurized gas lantern, I should say, much like a Coleman lantern would be.
Okay.
But now it's a 400-watt light bulb.
Okay.
That powers it.
Okay.
And these set of lenses, there's actually 4 of them.
Okay.
And they rotate it rotates every 30 seconds, so you have a 7.5 second flash.
Okay. Okay.
Now, what's really amazing about it, there were, again, like I say, between 37 and 40 of them made around the turn of the 20th century. There are only 7 left in the world in operation. This is the only one you'll see in North America.
Okay.
So it's exceedingly rare at this point in time.
Right.
And if you remember, if you looked at the lighthouse coming across this plateau, you saw the flash. You don't see it from the ground level here. Because the light is actually gathered by this upper set and lower set of prisms.
Okay.
And so that would gather that light that would be shining down or shining up and wasted.
Okay.
And then not be able to see, but it actually turns it and puts it back into this focal plane.
Okay.
So that lens system takes that 400-watt light bulb and turns it into over 1 million candle power.
Okay.
This lighthouse can be seen at 20 miles. It sits at 97 feet.
Okay.
And it sits above the ocean, above sea level at about 75 to 100 feet. So you're almost 200 feet off the water with it. And that puts it out.
Right.
Well, its horizon is about 20 miles.
Right.
So,
right.
Depending on the height of the ship and how clear a night it is, it's rough distance.
Okay. Okay. And is there still like any way, like, so when you mention like the times, like the flashes, like the interval, so do the sailors also know, like,
Yes,
they have that info? Yeah.
Yes, just like there's certain patterns for airports and all that. And you would know where the location is.
Right.
That is one of the key things for lighthouses, is that period of flash. It would be if they have a flashing lighthouse and they know it's 7.5 seconds, they know it's Cape Race.
Right.
But the other flashing lighthouses would have their own pattern, and that's how they would tell the difference between them. And yes, it's marked on their charts.
Right. Right. Okay. Interesting.
Typically, lighthouses without a period is what they call them, without that flash. Would be used for harbor lighthouses and such as that. So that's one of the reasons why they changed it over to a flashing light, so they can actually say this is Cape Race.
Right. Right. Okay. Okay.
In the middle 1800s, about the time that they built this lighthouse in the 1850s, there was a transatlantic cable built by the Anglo-American Telegraph Company.
Okay.
It actually did not come here to Cape Race. It went over to Heart's Content on the opposite side of the Avalon Peninsula.
Right.
Unfortunately, that cable, which the cross-section is right here, that cable burned out after 10 days.
10 days?
10 days. The electrician overpowered it and burned it out.
Okay.
And unfortunately for them, they had no funds to replace that transatlantic cable.
Right.
And investment was kind of down because the U.S. Civil War was coming. And so for that period of about 7 to 10 years, they had to do without that cable before it was replaced. And one of the workarounds that they used is they built a cross ground telegraph station here to Cape Race. And as ships were coming from Europe they would fire a flare and throw out a buoy with the latest news from Europe. The fellows here would actually row out and pick those up. They lost one from time to time, and the local fishermen were actually given a bounty of 5 cents for any one of those canisters that they could recover. They would sometimes even race the Associated Press people for the buoys so they could get their 5 cents. 5 cents in the middle 1800s.
Yeah, that must be a lot of money.
A lot of money. But these ships that were coming in, the captains were getting 5 pounds, which is British money, 5 pounds of British money, to throw that canister overboard. To deliver that news. And what that did is allowed important information from England and Europe. To get to New York and places on the eastern seaboard of the North America, to receive that information between 3 and 7 days before those ships could make it to port. So it was in terms of the stock markets and stuff like that. As soon as they could get the news, it was very important. It was almost being able to secure that information very quickly. In 1901, Marconi flew his kite from Signal Hill in St. John's. Unfortunately, Marconi, his test was successful, but he was not able to implement anything here in Newfoundland because the Anglo-American Telegraph Company owned a monopoly on electronic transmission here within Newfoundland. He did go over and work with Alexander Graham Bell in Nova Scotia out of his labs and started building a series of wireless stations there and perfecting his technologies. In 1904, when that monopoly expired, he was able to build here at Cape Race, which was one of his most important stations because of its location very close to the shipping lanes on the Atlantic. And again, we talked about its importance before. But Marconi realized that, and because his main priority was ship-to-shore communication, it's what any telegraph company could not do. So he was very instrumental in the development of ship-to-shore radio. He owned the radios that were on the ships, and he trained and employed the radio telegraphers that were there. One of the things that, as we're coming up to the Titanic era, that we know about these fellows, they were able to transmit via wireless telegraphy by Morse code. They were able to transmit 25 words a minute. That means that these fellows were not only thinking in Morse code, but they were also able to discern who they were talking to. It was a very small community, and they knew each other, so they knew when somebody came on by the style in which they operated their key. They could tell who they were talking to. Just like you would hear your wife or your husband's or your daughter's voice. And be able to tell the difference between your children.
Very interesting.
We call this the Myrick Wireless Center, and it comes from the fact that the first lighthouse keeper on the new lighthouse last name was Myrick. And through the generations, many of the lighthouse keepers here were Myricks. It was kind of passed down between father and son. The last Myrick lighthouse keeper here retired in 2008. So we had
still
over
very
100
recent.
years on this lighthouse of Myrick lighthouse keepers. Unfortunately, though, there wasn't enough jobs for all of the Myrick family that lived here. At one time, we had a population out here, getting close to 80 people, with between 20 and 40 of them being children.
Yeah.
So they were growing up here. Back in those days, not only were these people working here for Marconi involved in sending, Morse code. They weren't just telegraphers. They weren't just operating the radio. They were electricians. They were. They knew electronics. They had to. They had to install their equipment, and they had to be able to maintain their equipment.
Yep.
So here was this very new technology that these young people that were growing up here at Cape Race were able to be immersed in.
Right.
And they did that. As you can see from our panels here of different wireless operators that worked here, a fair amount of them were named Myrick. And that was because they learned their trades here from their cousins, their brothers, their aunts and uncles, and I mean, even ladies worked here. We had the dots and dashes. We had female telegraphers learning the trade out here. To the point where the story goes that night that the Titanic sank. The gentleman, Walter Gray, had been waiting to talk to his friend on the Titanic, talked to him all through the day, close to 10:30 at night here in Newfoundland time. He decided that it was time for him to check his equipment out and then retire for the evening. He left his assistant in charge of the radio room and went outside to do that. His assistant needed to use the restroom or do something else outside of that room, left it in charge of, long about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, a 14-year-old boy. And that 14-year-old boy was rumored to be the one who actually received the CQD from the Titanic. And CQD is the old form of Morse code, which is equivalent to SOS. That was sent. So it was actually a 14-year-old boy that received it. He immediately rushed out and notified the other people, but they never spoke of it until after those men had retired. If they had, they would have probably been fired. And the reason being is that all transmissions that can't come in to these stations are to be, how would you put it, would be confidential. Okay. They were secret. And that was important because lots of insider information, a lot of these telegrams included trading instructions from the captains of industry, the stock market trading instructions, or personal information that would be, damning if it got out. So, all these things were very secret. It would be like opening somebody's mail. At the time. It just wasn't done.
So in today's time, so first, how far was Titanic from this very point, maybe distance-wise or time-wise to sail to that point to rescue someone?
Now, sailing time really varied a lot because it was at a transition between steam and sail. In the early 20th century, of course, the Titanic was one of the fastest ships out there, and they were trying to break the record. That's the reason why they did not slow down when they were entering the ice field. The Titanic sank roughly 300 miles south and east of Newfoundland. And if we're looking right here off of Cape Race, we're looking south that way. East is actually that way. So we're talking, somewhere out there, about 300 miles. The Titanic that day, because it was an extremely clear night, the Titanic was, and a clear day before, they were able to start talking to Cape Race at about 700 miles, which is a good distance. Their normal range was about 500 miles on a clear day, but they were able to reach them unusually far out. It's even more surprising that in the days following the sinking of the Titanic, they were able to reach the Olympic about 1,200 miles out. So almost 3 times the distance that their normal range was.
That's right.
So, but there was a lot of things that came out of the sinking of the Titanic. They had what was called the Commission for Safety of Souls at Sea. They changed a lot of things in response to that, but as it pertains to Marconi and the radio, one of the most tragic things came about was that the Californian was another ship only 10 miles away from Titanic, just ahead of them. And the operator on the Californian radioed Titanic, and we told them of, sighting of a iceberg and an ice field that they were traveling through.
So they were notified on that night of that it could potentially happen?
They knew it was there.
Okay.
The response from and I'm going to qualify this before I say it, but in those days, because Marconi owned the radios, he trained the operators, his main focus of business was sending the telegrams.
Okay.
It wasn't necessarily for safety, and they really didn't have they weren't responsible for notifying the ship of every danger that could possibly. Now, you did that just because that's your moral duty as a human being.
Right.
And you respond. It was a tool, an additional tool for the captain of the ship to use it, but they weren't. Their main focus was sending telegrams.
Right.
Okay. And those personal communications. So on that night, this Californian, 10 miles ahead, radios Titanic and says there's icebergs and there's ice in the water. The response from Titanic was, shut up, I'm on with Cape Race.
Wow.
Now, that sounds very coarse, a very terse comment. But I'm going to say this of Jack Phillips. He'd been on the radio all day. He's working a very distant station, which Cape Race was.
Yep.
He's barged in in the middle of a conversation, or not conversation, but a transaction with Cape Race, and he hears this from the California, which is very close. So he may have been very, trying to hear this far away signal, and here comes a very close signal, really loud in his headphones. Right. So he may have been, and we talk. If you're familiar with somebody, you're kind of allowed to talk coarsely. To them. It's like when you're talking to your children. You wouldn't tell them to shut up in public. But if they're running around in front of your TV at night, you're going to say, shut up, get out of my way. I'm watching this. And I think that's more of what went on there. He was just very intent on doing his job, and he was being interrupted and wanted to make sure the guy knew that. Having finished his day's work, the operator on the Californian thought nothing more of it. He was done. He was the only operator on the Californian. He shut his radio off and went to bed.
Wow.
And so the closest ship to the Titanic had no ears. Okay. Wow. So that was one of the things that they addressed in this Commission for Safety of Souls at Sea. In that they mandated that all ships that carry passengers must have 2 operators. Okay.
That work in shifts.
That work in shifts. Ships that could, if they say you didn't have a lot of passengers, but you had, people on board, you could have if you had a Marconi radio, everybody had to have a radio at that point. And but if you didn't have 24-hour service, you had to have an alarm system that recognized an SOS. And that's what this is. This is actually a 1940s version of the automatic alarm system that was installed on ships going across the Atlantic.
Okay.
One of the other things that they developed here, I should say Marconi developed, that was available here from Cape Race. And this is a goinometer and a directional antenna. And what this is actually radio direction finding. And it's if you had a ship and you were many miles out to sea, you could request a bearing from Cape Race. Okay. And the ship would send a signal. They would rotate the antenna using this. It's much like a sonar, if you've seen sonar on movies. Right. And they could tell from which direction that signal was coming from. Right. They would radio back to that ship and give them that heading. Okay. If they wanted further information, they could call Nova Scotia or another station on the East Coast and do the same thing. Right. And all they had to do at that point is just draw in where the lines intersected. That's where they were approximately. Right. Right. This was available from the 1930s. Right. Here from Cape Race. Right. And again, this is Marconi. First, he had communications, much like our modern communications. First, he had communications. Yep. Then he had your equivalent to the 911 system. Okay. And then, of course, GPS. Yeah. Right. So they had everything equivalent of what we have today. Basically, everything that you have on your phone today, they had available from Cape Race. Those technologies were starting out here. So Marconi was a very, very astute. We don't see a lot of. Welcome, guys, to the part 2. Sorry for the interruption. As we continue. Yeah. So again, what I was saying is we don't give, maybe Marconi as much credit as we did. I mean, we talk about Tesla and Bell, and we talk about Westinghouse and all of this when we're talking. Right. But since Marconi was more interested in radio, but there were some very interesting developments that Marconi had come up with. Right. We wouldn't have our modern computers, our televisions, our radios without Marconi, because it was his company that developed vacuum tubes. He patented in England. His engineers developed the first vacuum tube. And then it wasn't very long, about another 10 years, they invented the heated vacuum tube. And those two developments basically became transistors in the 1960s. But in the days of early electronics, is very, very instrumental, very important in dealing with, stuff more than just, to be able to transmit, you have to have those technologies. Right. Again, one of the things that came out of the, Commission for Safety at Souls at Sea is implemented here in this chronometer that you see. And if you notice there's two little red triangles there that mean 3 minutes. So at every quarter past the hour and a quarter to the hour, those little red triangles were meant to be silent times. Okay. So that anybody transmitting an SOS would not be walked over by transmission. So anybody that and this went on all through the era of amateur radio and shortwave radio and all that. That at those times, you were not allowed to transmit, and just for people to be heard if they were in an SOS. If you can imagine a ship that's sinking and they're losing power and their output is very weak, or they're actually in a lifeboat, their radio isn't as strong as the radios. They could be walked on and nobody would hear them ever. That was implemented just for that circumstance. And when was this implemented? Right after the sinking of the Titanic. Yeah, okay. And one of the things, some of the things that we have that as we go into the era of the Titanic and what's going on here, we have today, when you get on an ocean liner or a cruise ship, your lifeboat drills are mandatory, and you must attend. When you get on an aircraft, you have to listen to their safety spiel. How to get off, how to put on your mask and all that. And that is a direct result of the Titanic. Okay, after the Titanic, these types of things
Right.
were realizations that
Right.
that would come about, and they become all part of our life. And unfortunately, it takes disasters like such as the Titanic
Right.
to bring these to our forefront.
Right. To learn the hard way.
To learn the hard way,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm just going to point out a few things here. Usually I don't do a whole lot of pointing out because these panels are actually very self-explanatory. But Jack Phillips, this young man here, celebrated his birthday on the Titanic just a few days before the Titanic sank. He was 25 years old, and he was a close friend of the head operator here at Cape Race.
Okay.
This fellow was an Englishman, and Walter Gray was a Scotsman, and they both trained at the Marconi facilities in England together. So they were actually very close friends.
Okay.
Harold Bride was his assistant operator. He actually survived the Titanic and was one of the people that were instrumental in the hearings that came out of the Titanic sinking.
Right.
Now, I want to point out something that, because this timeline brings it all kind of together. If you notice, this is where the Titanic sinks, or it hits the iceberg.
So 11:40 at night?
11:40.
Okay.
At basically 11 o'clock, this is where the Californian actually radios the Titanic and warns them of the ice field.
Right.
So,
So
we're only
about
talking
45
about 45 minutes
of okay.
before they hit it.
Right.
Now, by let me see here. Okay, he realizes his ship's sinking by midnight. So 20 minutes after they strike the iceberg, he realizes his ship's sinking. And then the distress call goes out 15 minutes later.
Wow.
Now, as you're going down, the Virginian and the areas, so the ships are starting to come out. He continues to send the CQD, and at 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic founders and sinks. There are no more signals after 2:17.
Okay, so that's when probably it was split and
By split and going down, and at 2:20, the Titanic sinks. It isn't until almost 2 hours later, 4:10, is when Carpathia shows up.
wow.
So they had been in the water for 2 hours
Wow.
by the time. Now, if that ship, the Californian, had been able to turn around and come to their aid, they would have been,
Story would have been different.
this would have been a different story. They would have been here,
Right there, yeah.
right?
So did the people that were on the Californian, were they ever kind of indicted for this, or were they ever put under the light?
It wasn't really their responsibility. And the Californian's operator did his due diligence.
Uh-huh.
It was unfortunate, but he had no blame in it. He notified them.
Right,
I mean, what more could he have done?
right, right,
Honestly, there was no crime really at that time.
right,
To be had. It was a really unfortunate event and a very tragic situation.
right,
That could have been averted if there had been a second operator on board. But hindsight's 20/20.
yeah,
Right? We can say just another 15 minutes.
Right.
Just stayed on it for another 20 minutes.
yeah,
The story would have been very different.
right, right,
And, history's full of those types of things.
right, right.
Unfortunate things.
So there are many stories of of shipwrecks and of course rescues and things like those. Have you personally, or in your family, that someone encountered anything of this sort, firsthand, that you noticed that was?
No, I've never had never been involved in any sort of shipwrecks. Although, this area of Newfoundland, it's in the memory of the area around here, and the stories have told. But it's been since the 1950s. There haven't been a whole lot of loss of life off the coast, and especially now in the days of when we've got GPS, there's just no reason for anything like that to happen.
Right.
Shipwrecks and disasters. I mean, you hear about the one that happened in Italy or something like that, and it was just a foolish mistake.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, somebody trying to do a little bit more than they should have been.
Right.
This panel here, and I don't know if you can actually see it on your, because it's kind of translucent there, but the white names are the names of those who perished. The yellow are the survivors of the Titanic.
So these are like the white ones here.
They are all the...
And there are the yellow ones here.
Dead, and the yellow are the survivors.
Okay.
So we had about 740 survivors on the Titanic, and about 1,200 or so, 1,250 or so perished.
Okay.
And I point out, because it's very easy for me to see them. We have families like the Andersons here, where you've got, 7 or 8 from Johan Anderson down to Ellis here, the Anderson family. And if you come over on this side, in survivor, Erna is the only person in their family that survived. And that, I only show you them. I know nothing about them personally, but that type of thing goes throughout this whole list. If you look at the list, there's 4 or 5 members of a family and 1 survivor. And certainly, that was, a very bad day for them.
So the lady that was featured in the movie, the old lady that tells the story, was that like she was an actual survivor, or that's just like
that? I think that is just.
She was just an actor, and like they were.
It was just
Okay.
It was really. I don't believe those people ever existed. Those names are not on this list.
I see. Okay.
So it was what they call, poetic license or something.
Right. Okay.
Created to make an interesting story.
Right.
One of the things that we see in the movies about Titanic, because they really can't show it well. That night the Titanic sank was a very dark night. It was a moonless night.
Yeah.
And it was very calm. And so in the movies, we see this bright, shining mountain of ice.
Yep.
And that's not at all what they would have seen.
Right.
What they would have been looking for is a black spot on the horizon, blocking out the stars.
Right.
So, basically a black spot where stars should have been.
Right. Just a silhouette.
That's all they could have seen.
Yeah.
So if they were saying 500 yards ahead, how good are your eyes at night?
Yeah.
Can you see something? Your depth perception is off. Everything. It'd be very hard to see night. That's why it was so very important to slow down.
Yeah.
And of course, Captain Smith, he was driving the Invincible ship, and he had a goal in mind to make the Titanic the fastest to cross on its maiden voyage.
And he also passed away.
Perished, yes, on the ship. He did not leave.
Yeah. Okay.
Although the owner who was actually pushing Captain Smith, John Ismay, I think his name was, the owner of the White Star Line, was on board as well. But he is on the survivor side of this panel.
Okay.
So he did survive, but it was kind of a big black mark for the White Star Line.
Okay.
To lose the Titanic. It was actually quite terrible. One of the things that they had to do, again, out of that Commission for Safety of Souls at Sea, was that there had to have been a spot on a lifeboat for every passenger on board.
So that's a real, like, it's a fact that there were not enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone?
They only had 16 or 18 lifeboats.
And that could fit how many people?
740.
Oh, so like there...
And there were some of them that were not full.
Wow.
So, maybe it had capacity for maybe 1,000. But the Titanic was not a full ship.
Right.
It could carry 700 or 1,000 more people than were on board.
Also, it wasn't even full capacity, and still we couldn't save all the...
Have enough capacity to save everybody on board.
Wow.
They only had, like I said, 16 lifeboats. And this whole, on the model of the Titanic that we have over here, if you notice, and maybe I'll step over here so I can block some of the light. But if you notice the lifeboats here, that whole upper deck was supposed to be the lifeboat deck.
Right.
And the owners of the ship actually had them remove the lifeboats and the davits They were supposed to be stored lifeboats upside down. They were supposed to be more davits all the way along, but they took them off because it made the Titanic ugly and because they wanted to provide a promenade for the first-class passengers.
Wow.
So that's another mistake that they made.
So there were mistakes even like mistakes were made even before they
left.
they entered the ship,
Oh, yeah.
the sea.
They did not have a lifeboat drill.
Right.
Captain Smith decided that he wanted to have a longer church service on Sunday, so he canceled the lifeboat drill.
Wow.
So incidentally, you had passengers that didn't know where to go orderly.
Right.
You had panic, and you had members of the crew that did not know how to operate the equipment to launch the lifeboats.
Right.
So it was terrible, and you had people that worked on the ship that sending people back below. Go back to your stateroom. We'll call you. The call never came.
Wow.
So there were lots of lifeboats. Now that's one of the reasons why you see, so many men on that list. Usually at that time, they made a differentiation: women and children first. Right. But at that time, they were getting ready to launch lifeboats. If they didn't have enough women to fill the boat, they grabbed anybody they could and put them on it.
Yeah.
Because they'd sent so many people back below.
Wow.
And they didn't know what they were doing.
Right. So all the confusion that they showed in the movie, that they were taking pocket knives to cut the ropes because they didn't know how to decline the lifeboats down, or those
Probably
were
very
realistic depiction of that.
I'm sure that they exaggerated it for the film. Right. But it's probably not an inaccurate description. Right.
Were any of the people that survived, that were part of the crew, that were questioned as to what happened and why these mistakes were made? Were there some court proceedings or anything that followed?
That commission was actually a joint U.S. and English commission. So there were hearings on both sides of the Atlantic. Right. Of course, the person that made the key decisions passed away. So I'm not aware of any trials or things that came out. I don't think that there were any criminal trials, so to speak, out of that. Right. Beyond the court of public opinion. Right. And White Star Line took a big hit from it, for sure. Yeah. Ismay, which was the owner. It was not really. It probably would have been far better for his company if he didn't make it. Yeah. He was actually, it was really kind of a sad thing. Yeah.
So the options were there, like to have effective communication with Titanic at the time, even in 1912. 1912 or 1915?
It was about 1912.
12, right.
1912. Okay. I think December 12th. I think 1912 or 1914, something like that. Yeah.
So
I'm
April
15th, 14th, 15th. Yeah.
Okay.
1912. So the technology was there. It was still pretty new, but we're still talking 10 years after the establishment of Cape Race. Right. It was still new technology, and not every ship carried the most modern equipment. The Titanic did. It was a brand new ship. Yep. And you can see actually the aerials on this model. The radio room is actually very front, and these wires that go across the top of the smokestacks, those are actually the aerials for the radio. Okay. So they're actually quite high, and a lot of them. So Titanic was carrying the most modern Marconi radio.
Interesting.
At that time, and they were in contact. Right. So the station here, as it came, they did what they could for a ship that was 300 miles off the coast. Right. They directed or assisted in directing other ships to the Titanic.
Right.
And trying to locate them.
Yeah.
And they notified the owners in New York.
Okay.
In New York. And continue to do that. One of the interesting things that they don't talk about a whole lot is that in the hours and days after the Titanic sank, the family members of those people that were on the Titanic started panicking and sending telegrams to almost every ship that they knew had a radio.
Right.
So if let's say you were a family of one of the Strausses or whatever, they started sending telegrams to every ship in the area that they knew was in the area to see, is so-and-so on board. And they were required to not only, forward all of these to those ships, but to receive and forward those messages back to the original sender. So they had days and days of backlogged transmissions that they had to send from Cape Race.
Right.
So they had lots of work. It was quite the busy time.
Right.
It was so. It was such an important event that it was even recorded in the diary of the lighthouse keepers. And it might be a little hard to read some of that because it's written in the handwriting of the time.
So this is the original?
Yeah, that's a copy of the original.
Okay.
The original actually belongs to family of the lighthouse keeper, the Myra family.
Okay.
And from what I understand, when they were building this museum, they come out and said, "Hey, we have something you might be interested in under my grandmother's sofa."
Right.
And they pulled out this diary, and of course it mentions the Titanic in it.
Wow.
But yeah, they would be.
So ever since I moved to Newfoundland and saw the icebergs for the first time, once last year we took a picture in Twillingate where a few people were kayaking pretty close to that. They might not essentially be very close to it, but from where we were seeing, it seemed like they were very close to the iceberg. So it gave me a good perspective of the kind of size that these things could have. And at that time, when there was a big one in Triton as well, and people were saying probably this was only a tenth of the size of what that iceberg was that the ship kind of collided with.
Yes.
So
one of the interesting things that has come out of what I can see on YouTube, because I do watch a fair amount of YouTube.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has come out is, with this accident that happened here last month or just a little over a month ago, was that they've actually been doing a lot of scientific work of imagery of the Titanic, trying to see how the Titanic sits. Because if you use visual, you can't really take a good movie of it because the field of view is so small. Yeah. But they can do, I'm not sure the technology they're using, but something like ultrasound or something like that, sonic waves or something like that, to do the imagery with. And what they've discovered is that there's no gash down the side of the Titanic. Yep. We've been told that there was for 100 years, there's this long gash down the side of the Titanic, just below the waterline. It doesn't exist there. So, they're thinking maybe the Titanic didn't hit a piece of the iceberg that is close to the surface, but because the icebergs are so much bigger on the bottom, they actually went over the top of it. Right. And ripped out a chunk of the bottom. That's kind of what they're thinking now, because the imagery doesn't show the gash that we've been told was there. Yeah. I mean, the story's the same. Yeah. The end result's the same. You can't change that. But,
I once tried to go for a swim in the ocean, and that too in the peak of the summertime, and still the water was so bitingly cold.
Yes.
We can't even imagine what like how horrific that must have felt being in the water, and that too like almost in the colder month.
I have been swimming in alpine lakes in the summertime.
Yeah.
And when you hit the water, if you dive in the water from, let's say, a rock in there, it will take your breath away.
Yeah.
And I have been in a panic because I could not catch my breath.
Yeah.
And water over my head.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine, that water was nowhere near freezing.
Yeah.
And the water, because it is salt water, it actually can be below
freezing. Yeah. Freezing. Yeah.
And people getting in that water aren't going to last very long.
Very long, yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you're wearing a life jacket or not. You're just not.
The hypothermia will take over.
You will, lose consciousness fairly quickly.
Right.
Now, depending on your exercise and your health level and whether you're able to get out of the water enough, almost everybody that were completely immersed in water, I would imagine, perished. Yeah. But I don't have any numbers to that. I do know that the ones that perished, the bodies that they did pick up were taken to Halifax, with the exception, I think, about 7. Mm-hmm. And 7, I think, were buried here in Newfoundland. This is what I've heard. Uh-huh. I can't confirm where or their names or anything like that, but they did find them. They were finding bodies as much as a month after the Titanic sank. Right.
Were there any people from Newfoundland on that ship? Do we know, or like any Canadians in general?
Oh, I would imagine, but I don't know of who. Okay. It would be. I would imagine that they're. Well, I mean, if you come over to the survivors of there, I mean, you have names of people of all sorts of races and nationalities. Right. I mean, you have people that have very much German names and Scandinavian names. Right. And I think that there's even one here, a Chinese Chung Fu. Mm-hmm. In here, you have Mubaraks, which are Egyptian. You have Olsons, O'Briens, which are Irish. You had all sorts of nationalities and races here. Wow. So yeah, I would imagine they're from all over. I do know. I can say that I've had people come that live here in Canada who said that my grandmother was on the Titanic. We went to the Titanic Museum in Ireland, and they issued us a ticket for her. Yeah. As a souvenir. But she never spoke of it. I've had people that have told me that their great-grandfather and grandfather were supposed to get on the Titanic, but a member of their church group had lost their luggage, and so they said they'd wait with her until her luggage showed up, but they never got on the ship. So they survived the Titanic, where everybody else in their church group did not. Right. So there's, a lot of stories like that. Yeah. That you hear. Right. And there's, of course, like when there's stories, there's also conspiracy theories that surround that as well. Yeah, and I don't, I don't give a lot of credence to conspiracy theories. I think it was a chain of very unfortunate events. Mm-hmm. And I think that it explains what happened well enough that we don't have to go to entertaining any of the conspiracy theories there. Right. I think that, there were mistakes made, and we may not know all of the mistakes that were made. Yeah. But we don't have to go to any of those lengths to explain it. And I can imagine, like, even the families of the survivors, or maybe the people that did perish that time, maybe like when all these things were surfacing, or I would say like when they're surrounded by all this speculation and conjecture, it must kind of bring back those harsh memories of that time, and they kind of have to relive through all of that every single time something new comes up. So it must have taken a toll on their mental health as well, isn't it? It's like you have to relive that horrific thing over and over and over. You wouldn't want to. Yeah. You wouldn't want to, would you? Yeah. And I would assume that would be the same.
Right, right.
You know, the human condition is that.
Yes, yes, that's true.
We just those things that are painful we don't want to acknowledge, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Much less entertain, you know, speculation.
That's right.
You
That's
know,
right.
You just don't want to. Don't need to go there.
Right.
We have enough pain as it is. You don't need.
That's true.
You know, you don't need to entertain the speculation that goes along with all of the other stuff.
That's true. That's true. So this particular section, like that's dedicated just to Titanic, is it relatively new for this museum or?
I was not here when this was put in, so I can't tell you exactly when it came in, but I would imagine it's about 7 or 8 years old.
Okay, lovely. Well, I think it was a great tour, and thank you for sharing these stories with us. I'm sure the viewers will love it too.
You're very welcome. We enjoy doing it, and if anybody that sees this wants to come out and visit us, we're open until between the 1st of July and the 15th of September, 7 days a week from 10 to 5.
Okay, perfect. And your name?
I'm Matt.
Matt? Mm-hmm. Well, Matt, thank you very much, and it was lovely meeting you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
All right, people. So that was Matt sharing some incredible stories of that unfortunate event, and how some things just can be avoided, but just we need to be a little more, I guess, a little more conscious of what could potentially go wrong. But sometimes we don't learn until the wrong has done, and at that time it's already too late. But yeah, that was a wonderful experience. This is the center where I am, by the Cape Race lighthouse. That's a gorgeous lighthouse. So I hope you guys enjoyed the session we had. It was completely impromptu. Like, I didn't even know that I would be doing this video, but I'm glad we did, and I hope you guys are glad that we did it. And yeah, if you guys are in Newfoundland, make sure to drop by. This place is called Cape Race, and it's incredibly beautiful, stunning landscapes, so many photo opportunities, so many amazing people to talk to, so many wonderful memories to create. I'll see you in the next video. Have a lovely day, guys.